Greetings, gentlemen. I was not able to cover the topic of suicide in South Korea with Electos, and Electos Deorum, chosen of the gods as he is busy divining the mysteries of the universe, and so it falls to me to do that. Received a couple of comments and even a PM asking me to cover the topic, so that's what I'm going to do here. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with my much older video, Shame and Guilt, and how they manifest themselves differently between the sexes and across cultures, here's a link. Please click on that. Please watch it, because it is a very relevant video, and I think an informative video, describing the differences between, say, a Western mindset, a Western culture, if you will, and a Confucianist culture as to be found in South Korea. And whilst you can understand what I'm talking about in this video, I would strongly suggest those of you who have not seen that video or have not watched in a long time to check that video out. So here's the link. Watch it, absorb the information, and I think a lot of the stuff I'm going to talk about right now will become clearer. So South Korea, for quite some time now, and fairly recently, has been consistently at the top three highest suicide rate in industrial nations. And in fact, very often it's number one, beating out other countries. So, it's always at the top three. It's a dubious honor, obviously. And it's a fairly recent issue. South Korea, to go back in history a little bit, was 60 years ago in a state of ruin. And it, I imagine, fairly admirably built itself up from the dust and the wreckage of the Korean War, and of course prior to that, Japanese colonialism. So the society's been through a lot. And here we are today in 2015, and everything has changed. The whole game has changed. Technological innovation, cross-cultural contamination, if you will, this development of a so-called monoculture. And they are the champions of suicide. Just to give you an idea of how prevalent it is, on average, every day in South Korea, 40 people die to their own hand. 40 people kill themselves. It is also the highest cause of death between the ages of 20 and 40 for all people, both men and women. And in places like Seoul, there's a bridge, the Mapo Bridge, over the Han River, that has been nicknamed the Bridge of Death, and the government tried to rename it the Bridge of Life, and there are all these sort of lights and messages placed there in order to prevent people from committing suicide. It hasn't really worked very well, and even recently, the government has decided they might introduce an application, phone app, in order to get people away from these thoughts. But I will be placing links in the low bar, of course, for all the stuff I'm talking about, so check it out if you're interested in that topic, or in this topic specifically. And what we see in South Korea, in terms of, not in terms of the numbers or the cause, but just in terms of suicide, we see the normal statistics. We see the typical asymmetry between males and females, with females attempting suicide not much more, but certainly more often, and males being much more successful, thus having a much higher male suicide rate. This is normally attributed to men pursuing suicide with greater conviction, greater method, and just willing to follow through with it. And in some sense, I suppose you can see this as an extension of the male spirit, right? Men tend to engage in activities that can really drive them to the brink, be it finishing a project, accomplishing a work of art, etc. And if a man is fully convinced that he wants to end his own life, then in all likelihood, that's what he's going to do. Women tend to second-guess themselves. You don't see it as often. So you do see this asymmetry. However, what is interesting about South Korea is it does have the highest suicide rate for females in the entire world. So even though we have the asymmetry that we encounter basically globally across the world, we do have the fact that women do commit suicide more often than any other, in South Korea more often than any other country in the world, which is fairly remarkable. Now, in order to understand this phenomenon of suicide in South Korea, you have to understand the Confucianist society. And once again, I make reference to my shame and guilt video. It'll be very helpful. But these are actually terms. There are guilt societies and shame societies. And the Confucianist or Neo-Confucianist society, however you want to put it, is what we call, or what anthropologists call, a shame society, where the emotion and feeling of shame is the most prevalent. And much of this has to do with the collectivist mindset. No, I'm not talking about Rocky Mystery collectivism. I'm talking about really probably the most pronounced form of collectivism around, Confucianism. One represents the many, etc., etc. And from this, we get a very different mindset with respects to how the world is viewed in terms of people relating to each other. If you commit a mistake, as Mr. Smith in South Korea, although I say maybe Mr. Kim would be better, you're not just committing a mistake as Mr. Kim. You're committing a mistake or an error for the whole family, the whole kajok. So that is somewhat different, I'd argue, and to a large extent, very different from what we'd encounter in a Western situation, in a Western culture, if you will. This desire to think of one as the many contributes greatly to the suicide problem. But interestingly enough, South Korea has been long been Confucianist in terms of its social interactions and cultural interpretations, and yet suicide is a fairly recent phenomenon, at least at this rate, that is, being the kings and queens of suicide across the globe. Where does it come from? Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the monoculture. You have this intermingling of very old traditions that seemingly cannot be let go of. And at the same time, this influx of international cultural interpolations and products and all kinds of things just entering the Korean market of ideas and social consciousness. And that is causing a lot of things to go haywire. It's the conflict of the individual against the rest of the world, at least in the confines of South Korean society. And even the many moons ago, where I used to live there, people, and things have changed a lot since then, I could see, people are not particularly happy in South Korea. I mean, you can argue no one's happy, but it's a very small world, and I don't mean the landmass, I don't mean the peninsula. Life is very constrained. As a child, you have no free time for yourself, mostly up until, even starting at 4. I mean, you're just studying from maybe the age of 4 or 5 onwards to university. University is sometimes considered the last days of freedom, and then you just work the rest of your life. And that seems similar to Western culture, but when I mean study, the parents send their kids to these institutions called hagwon, which are sort of cram schools. They study music and mathematics and English. English is quite popular. That's what I used to, when I was there, I used to work at one. And all kinds of things, all in preparation to take university examinations. And then they get in university, and they're hoping it's the top 3 or top 4, because otherwise, hey, you might just kill yourself. And in fact, that happens quite frequently. And after they graduate, it's just work, work, work. Well, that sounds like something everyone does. No. The difference is you have obligations in South Korean society outside of work. It's quite rare in a Western environment. I mean, you do have your company dinner outings or what have you, but when you're finished with work, you go home, and that's it usually. Maybe you have some projects. In South Korean society, if the boss says, let's go drink soju, which is this abominable alcoholic beverage that they drink there, that's what you got to do. Everyone expects you to do it. Your boss expects you to do it. Your colleagues expect you to do it. And you should expect yourself to do it. This creates an immense pressure on people to conform and indeed succeed. And success is not just doing a good job. As part of success, it lies in conformity. And getting back to university students or students applying to university, it's generally considered that you'll have no life, no good life, if you don't get into, say, the top 3 universities, Seoul National, Hanguk University, etc., in South Korea, because then your life is over. I mean, the Ivies, if you will, the Ivy League of South Korea, but unlike the United States, where you still have plenty of opportunities if you don't go to an Ivy League university, South Korea is quite different. Prestige is tied up with these universities, and in a Confucianist culture, it's all about degrees. It's less about what you know, what you can do. You have a degree from Harvard. I mean, they even have this hierarchy. You get a degree from Harvard, and you're special. Speaking of which, to escape a lot of this, many parents choose or elect, if they can afford it, to send their children abroad. If you will, my last ex-wife, she was a refugee from darkness, and she arrived in the United States when she was 15 or 16, and she's been gallivanting across the globe on her father's dime ever since. But I still am fairly sympathetic to her desire to escape South Korea. I don't have a neutral position towards her these days, even though she was quite an airhead, but still. Very, very claustrophobic, confined society, rigid society. And when you talk to Koreans abroad, in my experience, they all express a sense of relief having escaped, if only temporarily, from the confines of South Korean society. Yes, they miss their family relations, etc., but they feel relieved. It's like a breath of fresh air, and never mind the air pollution there. But when they go back, they realize they have to conform. And like a switch, just like a switch, they turn it on and they're back to, robot mode. Why am I telling you all about this? Because a lot of this has to do with the suicide rates. Prominent actors and actresses kill themselves. Students kill themselves in droves. Like I said, average of 40 a day pretty much. And more interestingly, you have a very high suicide rate amongst elderly people in South Korea. It is one of the leading causes of death in elderly people, as opposed to deadly diseases you'd expect. There was a story a while back of an elderly woman who basically poisoned herself with carbon monoxide in her own home so as to not be a burden to her children. I mean, here you have this collectivist mindset again, burden to the collective. Now, contrast that with the rugged individualism of the West. I'm using rugged in air quotes, and you get a quite different outcome. Yes, people kill themselves, but not in the droves, and not always for the same reasons. Many of the elderly people commit suicide for the reasons I just cited, because they don't want to be a financial burden to their children, because they just don't have the finances to live a good life in old age. And No Mu-hyun, maybe you've heard of him, some of you at least. No Mu-hyun was the president of South Korea, and he committed suicide in, I think it was 2009, May of 2009, if I remember right. And he did so out of shame. In his apology letter, he apologized for shaming the family, shaming everyone. And yeah. So this is not, there's no real class distinction in suicide in South Korea. Poor people kill themselves. Wealthy people kill themselves. The ages, they're slightly different reasons, but it just, all the way. And even school children apparently have at least had thoughts of suicide as young as, say, 10 years old. So it's almost an epidemic in South Korea. And when you combined the influx of this individualistic impulse that we have in the West with the conflicting collectivist impulse, it creates a dangerous cocktail. And how that manifests itself, well, a lot of that is talked about in that other video I mentioned. But I think ultimately what you see is what we're getting here: higher suicide rates, a greater willingness to follow through with it, and it's a conflict of interest. I mean, South Korean people. And when I looked at them back then, I'd be interested to see what they're like today. They weren't happy. They were constrained. They felt there was no creativity. I mean, even things such as this famous incident in a PC bang, a PC room as they call them in South Korea. This was years ago, maybe 10 years ago. A man basically died of coronary problems related to dehydration because he spent over 48 hours in a PC bang playing, I think it was StarCraft or some game, didn't eat, and of course neglected drinking liquids as well. And you see this all the time. I mean, I like to game, and of course it's a form of escapism, but these guys, when you look at especially the boys, I mean, they're just desperate for the whole escapism thing. And they zone out. They have to study all the time, and they zone out, and they go to the PC bongs or at home and whatever, and just play games. And in South Korea, they actually have, I've heard recently, like recovery, something along the lines of recovery camps from gaming addiction or what have you. So it's quite extreme there. On the other hand, you have the women who by the age of 30 are considered washed up, which that corresponds roughly to SMV, sexual marketplace value. I mean, a woman who's not married, it's changing slowly, but very slowly. But by 30, it's seen as a real oddball for the most part. And that it's not quite as bad as it used to be. And of course, the surgery. There's been great concern. It's gynocentric concern, but great concern nonetheless over very, very young girls' choices to get cosmetic surgery, facial surgery, most of the time. Very little to do with the body. Mostly it's just face, nose, the eyelids. That's very famous. Sankapul, where some subsector or even many East Asians lack what we call this fold. It's a fold, the sankapul in the eyelid, and so they surgically get that inserted, etc. And it might be beaten by Brazil now. I'm not sure, but South Korea, up until recently, and maybe even still, has the highest rate of facial surgery in the world. So it's an incredibly superficial society as well. It is, in my experience, the most, and I could be wrong. I haven't experienced every society, but if you want to experience superficial, go to South Korea. Everything is looks and everything is appearance, and with very little content behind it. That's why they have this reverence for degrees. Got a degree from Yale or Harvard, or MIT. I mean, sure, assuming these people are competent, but it's all about the surface and how you present yourself. And of course, those of you who've come to know me, someone who does not like the superficial bullshit we have to engage in to get by in this world, that rubs me wrong pretty well. It's one of the reasons why I'm actually not a fan of South Korean society. But all these things come together with the Neo-Confucianism, with the options of modernization, such as surgery and the gaming and all of this, and it's a big fucking mess. It's a hodgepodge of conflicting ideas and interests. And yeah, this is ultimately, I think, and once again, I reference that video, learn more about shame societies, what leads to the problems they're seeing now. And there's no fix for this, at least not directly. Quite on the contrary, the more Korea grows, the more it's industrialized, the more it's mechanized, the more the suicides rate goes up. And in fact, recently I read a statistic that at least proportionally, even though more men still kill themselves, proportionally the increase in suicide in women has been greater recently than in men, which is a pretty unique phenomenon because across the globe you see female suicide rates being much lower than male suicide rates. And there's not a quick fix for this. When you combine modernity, mechanization, and a very rigid Confucianist attitude towards the world, as well as an extremely superficial perception of the world and people, Koreans, this is not a genetic quality, but this is almost certainly, I will admit in this case, a social quality that is just very difficult to get rid of. But they tend not to be abstract thinkers. They're not very creative for the most part. And And a lot of that has to do with the rigid methodology that they employ in learning and education, and just the way they perceive the world. I mean, everything is just a surface, and below the surface, well, yeah, who cares? And this leads to problems. I would suspect, and this is of course me just speculating now, that a deep lack of self-reflection often leads to some of these problems and leads to people killing themselves. Now, this is of course circumstantial and anecdotal, but I had several ex-Korean wives, as well as many conversations with Koreans, and none of these people were particularly self-reflective with respects to anything apart from the things they were supposed to do, such as their careers, their jobs, their university degree, whatever it was they were doing at the moment. They didn't really think about the bigger picture. They didn't think about what motivated them. My last ex-wife's famous answer to everything was, "I don't know," right? Because this was a person who was essentially incapable of independent thought and really creative, reflective thought. And when I think about the other ex-wives, not as pronounced perhaps, but very, very similar, and then other experiences and so on and so on, it adds up. And, we talked about this with Electos in that video. It's a stifling society, and it leads to a kind of misery that it's hard to imagine in Western society. Western society, we are fortunate. I mean, everyone in Western society is fortunate not to have been born in South Korea. Now, I'm not hating on South Koreans. I have a sort of a lasting connection with the country, and I still keep myself abreast of the issues there. And I love the food. Korean food is my favorite food, period. But it is not a place you grow up in and receive happiness or even content. Constant pressure to succeed, be it in school, be it at the university, be it at the job, and then to relieve the financial burden to your children, and then you, in the case of this woman, you poison yourself with carbon monoxide. We're all very fortunate not to have been born in South Korea. And Korean Anglophones, that is, Americans and Australians and English people of Korean ethnic descent, are very fortunate to have not been born there either, because they really, really dodged a bullet. But there is no solution for this. There's no quick fix. This is going to get worse, not better. They've taken measures, but the measures have been only moderately successful. And this is part of a larger problem that I think, as we see down the years, it's going to get worse and worse and worse. I think South Korea will continue having this dubious honor of being the top 3 or number 1 in industrialized suicide rates across the globe. And it's very difficult to describe the society unless you experience it yourself. But yeah, it is a stifling, soul-crushing environment to grow up in and indeed to live in. And one of the benefits, if you will, of being a foreigner in that context is you're never accepted. I mean, I knew people that spoke perfect Korean, unlike myself, and they still weren't accepted. I mean, you're always going to be a foreigner in that context. Some people might accept you, but generally speaking, if you look different, there it is. I mean, I'll give you some funny stories. Back in the day, people would come up to me, and because I have absolutely no hair, they would rub my head like I was an object. They would just walk up to me in the street. Of course, it was just a curiosity. But I mean, there was almost this lack of human quality to me. Oh, look at that thing there with no hair. Or they would go up and rub my arm hair, because most Koreans don't have any sort of body hair whatsoever. Things like that. This is changing, obviously, and I think that would be less likely to occur. But the element of being a foreigner, I think, is a permanent state of things. Although these, depending on the area, obviously in Seoul and bigger cities, it's less of an issue. But no one's going to accept you as a Korean, which is, I think, actually for the best. Anyway, I hope that shed some light on the South Korean suicide epidemic, and I think it's fairly appropriate to call it that. And once again, check out that link to Shame and Guilt. It's a much older video. I did it years ago, but I think a lot of relevant information there. describing the difference between shame culture and guilt culture and what have you. And a heads up. So these next 2 weeks, I'm probably not going to be too productive with videos. Very, very soon, I'm heading off to Italy for a while, and I'm going to be back sometime at the beginning of May. And during that time, I won't be able to produce any video content, which is a pity, but it is what it is. I need to head off to Italy for that time, even though I'm not a fan of Italy, but not a Southern European, really. Much more of a Northern European, but anyway. So, yeah, if you see a less, or rather fewer videos coming out, that's the reason. And barring some sort of, catastrophe, a plane crash, death, total indigence, living on the street, fatal illness, all those pleasant things, I'll be back at it at the beginning of May. I will try to put out another video or two before next week sometime, but we'll see. I can't make any promises. Just want to give you a heads up because I have been trying to maintain a steady flow of basically at least 2 videos a week, and that's a pace I'd like to keep, but I can't do it if I'm not there with the right equipment, the mic, etc. So thank you for your patience and understanding, and I will see you for the next video, hopefully before I part ways for Italy to bake under the fiery orb in the sky, and probably 20 degrees plus. Ugh. Anyway, thanks for watching, guys, and I'll check you out later. Bye-bye.